The talk is called Inverting the Pyramid. We'll see what inverting the pyramid actually means in just a few moments. It's a talk really about feedback loops. Feedback loops, very important element of organizational design, not just the process design, but they are fundamental in terms of how people relate to each other, talk to each other, how we see what needs to be done, how we see what needs to be improved, how we understand how we're working towards our goals, and so on. Really fundamental thing, the feedback loop. So here's where I would often ask for a show of hands who recognizes this picture, who's into steam. So this is, it says, a governor and throttle valve. So those of you who've seen kind of the stationary kind of steam engines, as the steam engine gets faster and faster, the weights on the left, they're spinning round, they rise up, and as they rise up, through a series of levers, through a series of rods, they control the valve on the left. That reduces the amount of steam going through the system, and the thing slows down. And eventually, it finds an equilibrium where things are going at a stable speed. So that's how we regulate the steam engine, how we govern the steam engine. Next example. This is a little circuit called the operational amplifier. For some of you, those of you who've done electronics will recognize this picture. In your guitar amp, your hi-fi amp, before you get to the really powerful bits, the bit that drive your speakers, there's a little circuit at the beginning that takes those little signals from your guitar, from your turntable or whatever, and gets it up to a level that the power amp can work on. This little triangle thing is called an operational amplifier IC. I remember when I was a teenager, I got chickenpox. I was ill, off school for a few weeks. I was in my teens, very bored. My dad was studying electronics at the time, and we built an amplifier, or I built an amplifier with his guidance. This little chip, 8-pin chip, can magnify a signal by perhaps 100,000 times. Sounds fantastic. The trouble is, if you magnify a signal 100,000 times, what you mostly generate is noise. And you need some system to regulate the output of it so that it generates the signal that you want. Negative feedback. So that's another kind of feedback, another kind of regulation. And the question is this a good model for, clicker slowness again, is this a good model for feedback in our organizations? The unfortunate answer is no. They're actually terrible models for feedback and regulation in our organizations. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So in a traditional kind of organization, traditional setup, you may have experienced what I call drive-by governance, where you go to a governance meeting, or perhaps it's a meeting with your manager. Particularly in the case of the governance meeting, you meet with people that have no skin in the game, no accountability to your project, to your customers. But they think their one job is to find something wrong with your project. Have any of you experienced that? Very, very frustrating when you're working really hard, when you want other people's support, other people's help to help your project to be successful, that the people that they're talking to you are only looking for ways to pick holes in your project. So very frustrating. But Agile isn't immune from poor regulation, poor governance, poor feedback either. Many of you will have experienced the difficulty in implementing and sustaining retrospectives. So you have the retrospective that to start with happens religiously every 2 weeks, and then it starts to be every month, then it starts to be every quarter. And then if you have them at all, they're just a wine session. They don't seem to achieve anything. So it's worth asking why that is. And the main point of this talk is to help you understand how feedback loops should work, how they can work in a way that makes them meaningful and effective. I'll give you a couple more real-world examples. Just another explanation first of why those are such terrible governance systems, and it comes down to what's called the first law of cybernetics. Now, some of you might think the first law of cybernetics is this one: no robot shall harm a human, or through its inaction cause a human to come to harm. It actually goes by another name, Ashby's Law of Requisite Variety. Rather posh-sounding title. Posh-sounding title, but actually there's a famous paper that describes this law, and the title is very down to earth, and the title of the paper is also the conclusion of the paper. Every good regulator of a system must be a model of that system. So what does that actually mean? And we'll use a real-world example for this. Two types of drivers here. The learner driver, white knuckles clutching the steering wheel, and the paramedic driving through the streets of London. It's a busy city. I would ask for a show of hands here, and perhaps you can shout out. There's something funny about this picture. I'll give you a clue. This is a British learner driver. The price on the back of the car is in pounds. That's a British number plate. Another big clue, you can see the vehicles parked on the road on the far side are parked on the left-hand side of the road. So what's funny? Driving on the right. Well, he's driving kind of right down the middle of the road, and it's like his understanding of how to drive is you mustn't hit the curbs. Let's keep as far as possible from the curbs. He doesn't have a plan of what a nice route looks like down the road. He's got very little time to think about what's going on in the road. He's just thinking that curve, can I drive down the middle? Let's contrast that with the paramedic, the ambulance driver. And you might think it's just a question of skill. There's some basic capabilities, skills. Because of they've got the skill, most of their driving is actually completely subconscious. That saves a lot more brain power for maintaining an awareness of what's going on around. And because they've been doing this a while, they know what to expect, what happens, and they get good at anticipation. And that's often the mark of a good driver, is one that recognizes what happens before anybody else does, and you hardly notice them correcting to make the situation a good one. Think of it in terms of capabilities, though, isn't quite enough. There are multiple models going on in the head of the paramedic, but also in the heads of other people involved. The paramedic knows how his vehicle behaves. He knows even how his vehicle behaves under stress when he's driving, very hard, very vigorously through, at high speed through traffic, around obstacles, and so on. He knows how traffic behaves. He knows how traffic behaves in general. He also knows how to get from A to B on a Monday morning during the rush hour, for example. He knows how the control room works, and he knows how to interact effectively with the control room, in order to get your message across quickly, in order to update your status, to get status from other people, and so on. The paramedic understands how the hospital systems work. He knows which door to show up at with particular kinds of patients. He knows when should I phone ahead to warn the hospital that we've got a difficult case coming in. He's also a medical professional. He understands the human body. So that's a whole new set of models that he has to learn, mainly through education, but also through practical experience as well. And then what I call multiple agendas. It's not just enough to know how things work in general. There's also the specifics of the situation. So what state is the patient in at the moment? And how is his condition likely to progress if we don't do anything? How is his condition likely to progress if we intervene? So that's that from the paramedic's point of view. The patient himself has an agenda. He wants to live. He wants to be well. That's a pretty powerful agenda in its own right. The control room has an agenda. They're managing multiple incidents all over a big city, all over perhaps an area very much bigger even than a big city. Multiple incidents, a fleet of ambulances to control. They've got targets to meet in terms of response times and all sorts of other targets and so on. The hospital has an agenda. It has patients that it's managing already. There are patients coming in. It has to be ready to meet demands at particular times of the day, particular days of the week, and so on. And the driver himself has an agenda. He wants to do a good and professional job for as many people as he can over the course of the day. He has a longer-term agenda in terms of professional development and so on. So lots of different agendas from different people, but coordinating with each other to achieve great results for the patients, we hope. So here's the punchline right at the beginning of the talk: less learner-driver, more paramedic. That's, how can we make our organizations more like the paramedic, less like the learner-driver? And what I'm going to do is take 4 models and sort of smash them together. We're going to put them into the great model collider and see what kind of things will come out of it. And if you're looking for inspiration, just putting ideas together and seeing what comes out is a great way to do it. The first model going into the collider is what's called the inverted pyramid. If you've not seen this before, it's a beautifully simple model. It comes out from Nordstrom and in the retail space in the US. And the simple idea is the job of the organization is to support the people that serve the customers, or to support the people that deliver to customers. So from the CEO upwards, our job is to make sure that those people have what they need, that they are developed, that the organization develops in the way that it needs to, in order that we can serve our customers better. And that is it. Very simple, beautifully simple model. The next model is a little bit more complicated. Again, I would ask for a show of hands how many people recognize this. But this is what's called the Kanban Cadences model. This is a model of feedback loops as taught in the Kanban community. But the nice thing about this model is that you can understand it whether or not you've learnt Kanban. There's a bit along the bottom. You could call this a very high-level view of the delivery process. Replenishment stroke commitment meeting on the left, stand-up meeting in the middle, delivery planning meeting on the right. If you don't have to use those names. Every delivery process has some way of deciding what should go into the delivery process. Any effective delivery process will have some way of keeping a regular check on what is going on and dealing with things that need to be dealt with. And every delivery process has a way of deciding what comes out of the process and when. Now, sometimes you decide that at the beginning. Sometimes you do it opportunistically as soon as you've got stuff of value to deliver. But essentially, any effective delivery process will have those 3 components, and you can look at how those work, and you could look at improving those individually and look at improving how they relate to each other and so on. Up the middle, we have an axis that we could call the adaptability axis, the agility axis, the alignment axis maybe. So how does what we're doing day to day relate to the kind of service that we would like to give our customers? And how does that relate to the operational goals of the organization and to the big decisions about where we're going to invest, what structure of organization we're going to have, what projects and programs we're going to do if we talk in terms of projects and programs and so on. So nice simple model. I've highlighted the service delivery review box in the middle because we will come back to that in a few moments. The next model to go into the collider. Now this is mine. I'm a consultant. I like to draw triangles. This is from chapter 1 of the new book, from the Agendashift book. And the point I was trying to make here is there are different kinds of discovery. Now, most of us understand, or many of us understand discovery as coming from the product space. We spend time working with customers, with potential users, understanding what their needs are, trying product ideas out on them and seeing how well they work, understanding who they are, understanding their needs, and so on. But if you're in the product space, you realize very quickly that what the man in the street understands by product is never the whole product. And if you're in the product space, whole product is actually important piece of jargon. There's always bits of process, things that you need around it. You need to be able to support your product. You need to be able to sell your product. You need to be able to maintain your product, and so on. And from the customer's perspective, if the customer sees that those things aren't in place or don't work well enough, they are going to be less inclined to buy your product. So these things really matter. When you're talking about a more sophisticated product, and I'm going to take I'll actually do my shoelace up quickly. Take my phone as an example. When you buy a phone, you don't just invest in the features offered by the phone at the time that you buy it. You're also investing in the features that you believe the vendor will provide over time. Now, you're investing not just into a device, you're investing in a platform. With more sophisticated devices, that's becoming increasingly true. That's becoming true even of cars. If you buy a Tesla now, you're not buying just the car, you're buying into the charging stations and everything else that goes with it. You start to worry about how your car is going to be maintained, serviced, and so on. To an extent, you even start to worry about the organization. What kind of mission does it have? What kind of values does it have? And so on. So, for example, some people will choose their device according to their opinion of the vendor's attitude to concerns like privacy, for example. So you might choose a phone vendor based on its aesthetics, and those kind of values, privacy, security, all these different concerns. So my clicker is misbehaving again. Let's move on to the right-hand corner, Agile. So Agile starts really in the bottom right-hand corner, with slightly ironically, but with process. And the promise of Agile process is that it gives us more adaptability and better delivery performance. And I think by and large that tends to be true. Agile has also moved to the left into the product space. So thinking about tools like story mapping, which I think are fantastic, impact mapping. So different ways of understanding how the users of our digital products and other products will interact with our systems. We tried to scale Agile, but in my opinion, most of that scaling stuff is over on the right-hand side still. It's just more process, bigger process, and sometimes that at the expense of things like values and so on. So I think there's still quite a bit of work to be done for some of the things that are more in the, looking that way, the top left of this picture. With Agendashift, we start very much with organization and product. We start with what do we need to achieve as an organization, what do we need to achieve on behalf of our customers, and so on. We then look at our delivery process and our adaptability, not in a prescriptive way, but just looking at what are its characteristics. Are we getting the kind of outcomes that we want from our process? Do we think consciously about adaptability? Do we have the tools for managing change in our organization, whatever they might look like, and so on? So without being at all prescriptive about process, we sort of shine a light on it and help people identify where it needs to change. So that's the Agendashift discovery triangle going into our model collider. The last one, the fourth one, is the ideas of leader-leader and mutual accountability. So the idea of leader-leader comes from the book Turn the Ship Around by David Marquette. Of all the books I read last year, this, I think, was my favorite. And there's this phrase that it's not a phrase that everyone picks up in this book, but there's a phrase I picked up, was this one of mutual accountability. Now, if you're going to talk about accountability, another great book is 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. Little tip, if you've not read these books, and I strongly recommend that you do, they're very readable books, and they also work fantastically as audiobooks. The Marquette book is narrated by the author, and he's a former captain of a nuclear submarine. I mean, how cool is that? So it's the story, it's called Turn the Ship Around, and it's about turning around what was one of the worst submarines in the US Navy fleet to one of the best. And how did he achieve that? And he thought about that, and he achieved it by thinking very deliberately about organizational design, leadership behaviors, and so on. And it started with his own leadership behaviors. 5 dysfunctions of a team. One of the dysfunctions is lack of accountability. I've worked in worked in and with a number of organizations where lack of accountability between members of a leadership team, which is the situation described in the book, has been painfully apparent. Leaders that will say, oh, this is going to change, this must change, and you come back 3 months later, 6 months later, and everything is exactly as it was before. No accountability, no follow-through. Digging a little bit into the model, now we have to understand that David Marquette is coming from a military background, from a naval background, and the illustrations that he uses are ones about someone senior wanting something done. So they explain what they want to have happen, and somebody below them, in his model, then says what he intends to do. Now, those of you who have heard of leader's intent will realize that actually that's a very clever, in a way, turning the idea of intent upside down. So instead of it being all about the leader's intent, it now becomes about the intentions of the person who's going to carry out the order. But in turning that upside down, it actually crystallizes what leader's intent is all about. And that is that it's about not micromanaging, but letting people respond situationally with all the skills at their disposal and causing the outcome to be achieved. Thinking a bit more horizontally, it's a bit more in Lencioni terms. If we're transparent about what we intend to do in our teams can decide whether that's actually something sensible. Well, it might have a view on whether the person stating that intent is capable of carrying it out and support them in that if they need that support, and so on. Putting these ideas together is actually a pretty good model for agile organizations. Organizations where it's clear what we want to achieve, how we want to achieve it, and through that, developing the capability of people and of teams and of the wider organization so that they can actually carry out what they intend to do. So that's the 4 models. Put them into that great model collider, and I get this. And if I did it again, I'd get something else. But this is what I get this week. And I'll walk you through this in stages. And the stages will be right to left, outside in, and upside down. So we'll start with right to left. If you want to understand Lego, where do you start? Do you start with children playing with a toy, and then thinking about, well, what kind of Lego packages can you buy, and then understanding how it's made? Or do you start with a bin of plastic feedstock? So children playing with a toy, plastic feedstock. Which do you start with? Now let's turn that now into Agile. If you want to describe Agile, do you start with people collaborating around working software, or do you start with Jira? Working software, Jira. It strikes me that many descriptions of Agile actually start with the backlog. Would actually be much healthier if we started with what it is we would like to achieve with real people using our products and collaborating with customers as we deliver the products and so on. So abstracting that a little bit, we start on the right-hand side at the point, not just of delivery, but where we know that needs are being met. Then understanding how we get to that point and how we get stuff, from, for example, our development environments into the hands of customers. Then we think about the work that we're actually currently doing, the things that we're developing, things that we're not quite sure yet how they're going to work out. And we finish with all the things that we would like to do. So right to left, starting with the output, working our way backwards to the input. And that's actually a very good way to manage a process as well. So is our production system working as we want it to work? Not just in technical terms, in terms of performance, but does it appear to be doing for our customers what we expect it to do? Do we have a clear pathway into production? Can we release at will? Is our workload under control? Do we know what's working, what's not working, what we're blocked on, what we're not blocked on? Do we have the right amount of work in our system, and so on? Do we understand what's coming next and how that relates to our overall goals as a team? And already sowing the seeds of how to improve the process. So this is cool. The way we approach a process for the first time to understand it, the way we manage it, and the way we improve it, they're all the same, right to left. So do we have all the tools that we need to really understand how our customers use our products? Are we spending enough time with our customers to fully understand that? Are our systems well enough instrumented to deliver us all the intelligence that we would want, and so on? Do we have a really slick deployment pipeline, development pipeline, and so on? Are we really careful to only take on work when we have the capacity to do it, when we understand what's involved, and so on? And do we have a clear understanding of what's coming next and why we might want to do it? So that's right to left. Just to really push that point home, I created this a few weeks ago. I think of all the posts I've put on LinkedIn, I've had more response to this than any other. And the response is about 95% positive, 5% negative. So the 5% negative is, how dare you subvert the concept of definition of done? I've subverted the concept of definition of done to make a point that 95% of people get. And that is, if our work isn't about meeting needs, then why are we doing it? And if we're serious about meeting needs, we need to be serious about understanding who those people are, who the someone is in this, what their needs are, understand what an authentic situation of need looks like, and explore that, model that. And when we finish the work, make sure that that need was actually met. In my first book, I described a situation where I was so sick of delivering features that nobody used. I said, right, at the end of each piece of work, there's going to be a conversation between the customer and the developer in which the customer is going to confirm to the developer that, yes, this is meeting my needs and already delivering value. I was angry when I implemented this. What I didn't realize, I just discovered validation. And it had a profound impact on the way the whole process worked. All our last-minute implementation work was focused on a happy outcome. The customer would get involved in the testing, making sure that the conversation wasn't going to be an embarrassed one. They would keep half an eye on the development work, and they would be very careful about what they prioritized because they knew that this conversation was coming at the end. So if you start with how you would like to validate it, and make sure your whole process is working towards that happy outcome, it can have a fundamental effect on your process. The other thing about this is very easily referenceable. Agendashift.com/done. Just use it whenever, use the URL or use the image if you're tired of those really tiresome conversations. Is it done? Is it done? Is it done? Is it done? And so on. You've all heard those kind of conversations. I think that's ready to be subverted, that whole idea. And if you want to replace definition of done with something more appropriate, definition of ready works at least as well. We're going to move into outside in. Before we do, I'm going to introduce another book to you. This is the second book that I've introduced in talks in recent years. It's one of those books that's often cited but rarely read. A couple of years ago, I was when I was doing talks like this, I was speaking on servant leadership, and I encouraged people to read Robert Greenleaf's book, Servant Leadership, written in the 70s, and actually a very prescient book. Greenleaf really understood the way that society and organizations were going and why servant leadership was something that was going to get more important, not less, over time. I used to ask for a show of hands at conferences, who's read Greenleaf, and maybe 2 hands would go up. Often cited, everybody cites the Greenleaf book when they're talking about servant leadership. Unfortunately, the idea has been diluted into just serving the team, and it gets taught in Scrum Master training. Another book, Christopher Alexander's The Timeless Way of Building. I'm going to try and see how many hands go up. So who has read A Timeless Way of Building? I do see one hand over there. That's about right. So this, believe it or not, is the book that launched the patterns movement. So pattern languages, all that kind of stuff. Very big in the 90s, slightly showing my age. But actually a really profound book. It's a book about architecture, the built-in architecture, the built environment. And it's about patterns, not just as building blocks, but understanding how different patterns relate to each other. You could say it's about colliding ideas again. And there's this lovely quote, "A thing is whole according to how free it is of inner contradictions. The more free it is of its own inner contradictions, the more whole and healthy and wholehearted it becomes." And I love that paragraph. And, reading the whole book, I was thinking of this architecture book as a metaphor for organization design. And I thought, wouldn't it be great if we were in the business of building wholehearted organizations? Ones in which, the contradictions were, first of all acknowledged, then owned, and then resolved in some way that makes the thing more wholesome. So that leads me to another kind of feedback loop. But before the feedback loop, let's imagine you're faced again with approaching an organization and really trying to understand what makes it tick. A great way to do it is to start from the outside. So let's get an outside perspective. I need to stand closer to my laptop, I think. Let's get the customer perspective. Then how is the organization set up to serve its customers? What kind of platform does it have? What does its product portfolio look like? What kind of technologies does it depend on? How well do those perform? What new products need to be in the pipeline? What new technologies should we be looking at, and so on. Then the individual products themselves, and we're getting down to the level of individual product lines, and understanding what's their relationship to that whole portfolio. How do they support the overall goals of the organization? How do they meet the needs of customers, and so on? And lastly, the actual work that's getting done by the teams in the organization. And it turns out that's a very good way also of thinking about how you would do a capability review. So like for the service delivery review meeting that was in my Kanban Cadences slide. So when from fortnightly, monthly, you want to review how well you're doing. Let's get a customer view first. And you can think about who are all the people that would best represent how our customers are experiencing our products at the moment. So you might talk to your help desk, you might involve your user researchers, and so on. People who really have, they're not just the voice of the customer, they are truly connected to the customer, listening to the customer. You might even have customers that can be present in your meetings. Then the organization, and then the question is, who can best represent the organization? What is the organization trying to achieve? But working it both ways, mutual accountability and all that. How is the organization supporting us in our work? What does our platform look like? Our production platform from a stability point of view, capacity point of view, for example. What new technologies are we looking at? What's in the pipeline for our product and why we're doing this and how is that good for our customers? And lastly, the work we're doing for our team, not necessarily every piece of delivery work that we're doing, but all the pieces of work that really speak to improving our capability. So that could be process improvements, it could be strategic product improvements, anything like that. Anything that's going to benefit from having these 5 different perspectives looking at the work. But it's not enough just to talk about it. We end up with a talking shop, the retrospective that's just a whining session. We need to talk about what we've learnt recently through our recent experiments. We need to discuss the pieces of work that are currently in progress, the experiments that we're currently conducting on our organization, and on our products and through our products on our customers, and the further experiments that we would like to carry out and what we would hope to achieve by carrying them out. So if you're stuck with retrospectives that are running out of steam, you might think it's because we're not making our retrospectives fun enough. It might be because they're not meaningful enough. You're not actually engaging enough with these different concerns, and especially with external customer concern. There's not enough accountability between the different parts of the organization, the different people responsible for those different concerns, and there's not enough accountability over time. So you're not actually reflecting on what you learnt since the last time, and you're not checking that the experiments that you completed last time really have delivered the results that you hoped. You are setting yourselves up for scrutinizing the work that you're currently talking about the next time, and so on. So you keep that agenda moving, meeting by meeting. So that's really outside in and left to right together. Taking the upper level into transformation, not just team-level retrospectives, but organizational transformation. This is how we do it in the Agendashift workshops. So on the right, we have our Kanban board in which we're managing our experiments. And if you know Kanban, you review. I should stand over there, but my clicker will stop working. You review right to left. Start with the things that you've just learnt. Is the stuff that's just completed going to stay completed? What can we get over the line to complete it? What do we need to unblock or collaborate on in terms of the work that's currently going on? What's the relative urgency of the pieces of work in our pipeline? The thing on the left, you might think it's a Kanban board. It's actually more like a story map. But it's a story map not of user stories, but of outcomes. And at the end of the talk, if we've got time, I'll give you a flavour of how those outcomes are generated. There's a lot of detail in that picture, but you might be surprised to learn it was created in only 30 minutes. 15 minutes to generate the stickies, another few minutes to organise the map. Upside down. So here, remember, is our inverted pyramid. CEO at the bottom, an organisation that supports the staff that deliver to customers, meet the needs of customers. So making that look just a little bit more processy, but without being at all prescriptive or minimally prescriptive. We have a delivery process that ends in validation, making sure that we are meeting the needs of our customers. Starts with discovery, identifying who those customers are, what their needs are, and so on. And there is some unspecified process in between. So by minimally prescriptive, I would strongly suggest to you that most delivery processes, in fact, many organizational processes, will benefit from being more formal about validation, more formal about discovery. Validation is the way to get away from that old school, it's done because the development is done, and into something a bit more meaningful. We've still got the CEO at the bottom. We're not going to fire him, but rather than talk in terms of senior people and junior people, we're going to talk in terms of processes that may actually have both kinds of people in it. So there is part of the organization that is responsible for the development and clarification and expression of the mission of the organization. And that's something that actually can involve people from all parts of the organization. If you've come across a thing called strategy deployment, that is making strategy into a participatory process where people from across the workforce, even customers, are involved in putting strategy together. Between those two, capability. So what are we doing to improve our capability, to improve our performance, to develop brand new capabilities, and so on. And instead of an org chart, a hierarchical org chart, we've got circles of overlapping circles of people reviewing their work left to right and outside in, making sure that stuff gets finished, that completion focus, and so on, but also making sure they understand what it looks like from the customer's perspective and all those other perspectives. So building up through the layers. So that's right to left, outside in, upside down. That's a little model there. have to stand over here again. So that really leads us straight to the punchline: less learner driver, more paramedic. And I would suggest to you that you look at your feedback loops. Make sure your feedback loops are right to left in terms of you start with what meeting needs look like and work backwards. Make sure that's visible. Make sure that you're accountable to each other across your teams to deliver that. Make sure that there's accountability over time, so that you do follow through on things over time, and you start to reap the benefits of all of that good work that you're doing. More outside in, do start to get some different perspectives, not just the team's perspective on the work that you're doing, and more upside down. Instead of seeing the organization as the enemy, look for ways in which teams and the organization can work together in a way that supports the team and improves alignment between the team and the organization. And if we can do all of those things, I think then we would have more wholehearted organizations, ones in which the contradictions are exposed and owned by people, and ultimately resolved in a way that brings satisfaction all round. So that is the main part of the talk. We're now going to do a little interactive exercise. We still have a few minutes left. The clock here is saying 17 minutes, but I'm going to try and finish not many minutes after 11 o'clock. I just want you to consider this true north statement for a moment. Imagine everyone able to work consistently at their best. Individuals, teams, between teams, across the organization and beyond. And you might find some of the images that we've seen in this talk helpful for that. Right conversations, right people, best possible moment, needs anticipated, met at just the right time. Okay? Got your heads around that? What I'd like you to do now, I don't know if it's worth having the house lights turned up a little bit, but I'd like you to talk to your neighbour and just ask each other, what's that like? And when you've got a sense of what's that like, then what's different? How does that differ from how things are now? So I'm going to set the timer for 1.5 minutes. I'm going to try and finish somewhere around 11. So starting now, what's that like? What's different? Okay? I can't see you, but I can't hear you either. Right, we'll stop it there. Another question for you. That was question 1, although it's a 2-part question. Question 2, what obstacles are in your way? Okay? So 1.5 minutes again on what obstacles are in your way. What stops you getting this? half a minute. Right, we'll stop it there. Another question. This is one where the English is perhaps a little harder, and it is, when my clicker works, what would you like to have happen? Okay, so a minute and a half on what would you like to have happen. Right, in my bid to finish on time, I will stop it there. Right, next question. A much simpler question, and I'll give you just a minute for this one. So you've started with the true north. You've thought about what would be different. You've thought about what obstacles would be in your way. You've thought about what you would like to have happen. Now, relative to what you would like to have happen, then what happens? Okay, then what happens? 1 minute. Right, I'll stop it there. So you've had you've done like the conference version of a game called 15-Minute Photo. So this is a game I've open sourced, and the idea is in 15 minutes, can you go from obstacles to outcomes? That's what the FOTO stands for. Using just these questions, these clean questions. What would you like to have happen? And then what happens are the two most important questions. But other kinds of questions as well. What kind of thing is that? What kind of collaboration? What's happening when you get this collaboration? Is there anything else about collaboration? What happens before collaboration, and so on? You'll see that I've highlighted the questions that you've used already. What would you like to have happen? And then what happens? These are the questions we use the most. Whenever we hear something that sounds negative, sounds like an obstacle, we use what would you like to have happen? And by default, the next question is, then what happens, then what happens, then what happens? And very quickly, we can generate a whole string of outcomes that start with very concrete things, the results of quick fixes, and finish with long-term goals, values. Collaboration was an example that I used as the kind of value that often gets exposed in this kind of conversation. And it's a conversation you can have with people that have never been exposed to Lean or Agile before. Very subtly, there is some Lean and Agile thinking written into that true north statement. So, collaboration, conversation happening at the right time, Just in time is there in a slightly more humanized form from Lean. So even an uneducated audience can generate outcomes that are consistent with Lean Agile values. It's remarkable how this works, and very quickly can generate outcomes in the kind of numbers that we saw that we can arrange on the map. Now, I'll go backwards. Go on. Is it going to work? Here we go. In the picture here, Ruta's holding a card with the questions on. We've had a few printed. Paul, do we have them? Not for now, but for later. Yes. We do. Fantastic. So I'm going to volunteer a session for the open space, either today or tomorrow. And in the end, it's what we do is up to you. But if you'd like to practice these questions, see how the game works with some of these cards, we'll give that a go in the open space session. I apologise for my clicker. Just going to wrap up now. So a lot of the resources that you've seen, so the cue cards for the game, things like the done thing and so on, they're all available at the Agendashift website, at agendashift.com/resources. Many of them are Creative Commons as well. And that's the way that these, for no effort from my part, that's how these things get translated and used all over the world and so on. Just one last mention of the book. I didn't mention the books in the beginning in my introduction because Paul did such a lovely job of introducing me. So Kanban from the Inside, really based on the original blog post introducing Kanban through its values. And it was a very easy step from values to outcomes, which is what the second book is all about. It was out in print only last month, so it's still quite new. But I'm already planning a new book. And the working title is from this talk, so right to left, outside in, upside down. And if you're interested in either how to apply those kind of ideas in your organization, or you have some great examples in your organization, or you have some great examples of models that inform right to left, outside in, inside out, then do please join us in our Slack group. And there's a right to left channel there. But you'd be very welcome in our Slack anyway. And I think that is probably it. But where are we doing for time? It is 11:01. I will stop it there, and thank you very much. I'm sorry I couldn't see you, but I could just about hear you.